to this beginning of our 7th International Conference of the Whitehead Research Project. I want to mention only 1, 2, 3 facts. One is, tomorrow, 9 years ago, I landed in California for my post here. Wow. Tomorrow. It was 2005. 2006, I created the Whitehead Research Project with the help of some very eager students. There was nothing else around for it. No money, nothing. It hasn't changed a lot. In 2007, we had our first conference, WRP Conference, and since then we had very interesting conferences with very different people invited to mix it up, if you want. And this time, I want to thank especially Jeffrey, who has co-organized it with me, and Joe Paddock, who is outside, I think. You probably have had contact with, who has done most of the work, and some other students that were very helpful, Daniel, Lydia, John, and Sam, and Andrew, for helping us to get that together. So we'll have our first presentation. It's altogether about an hour. And after that, we will rearrange that for our food, since we have competition tonight at the other side. So we cannot go to the place on the other side, which is the nicer place. But we will make it a nice place for you, and then we have our foods here tonight. So welcome again, and have fun.
I'll just introduce our first keynote lecturer, Stephen Shaviro. Is the DeRoy Professor of English at Wayne State University. Is the author of Connected, or What It Means to Live in the Network Society, 2003. Without Criteria, Kant, Whitehead, Deleuze, and Aesthetics, 2009. Post-Cinematic Affect, 2010. And The Universe of Things, on Speculative Realism, forthcoming in 2014. It's actually out, wonderful. He blogs at the Pinocchio Theory, which is a really fun blog. So. Stephen.
Thank you. I'm a little bit daunted by being expected to speak for longer than everybody else, except for Steve Meyer, but I'll do my best. So, okay, so I'm not sure that there's anything really new here, sort of going over the same stuff, but when Jeff and Roland invited me, they said this focus was symbolism, so I reread that book many times and tried to think about what I could do with it. And, okay, well, I don't know how long this is going to take, but okay. Whitehead discusses symbolism, among other reasons, in order to get a handle on the problem of error. This, of course, is something that has preoccupied Western philosophy for a long time. Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy begins with his worries about how numerous were the false opinions that in my youth I had taken to be true, and how doubtful were all those that I had subsequently built upon them. Whitehead's erstwhile collaborator Bertrand Russell similarly opens his own volume on the problems of philosophy with a question: is there any knowledge in the world which is so certain that no reasonable man could doubt it? Modern Western philosophy, from Descartes through Kant and on to today, generally privileges epistemology over ontology. We cannot claim to know the way things are without first giving account of how it is that we know. We cannot consider the consequences of our proposition, mainstream philosophy tells us, until we have first assured ourselves that it is free from error. Whitehead gives his own deceptively bland statement of the problem of truth and error towards the beginning of symbolism. It's a quote: an adequate account of human mentality requires an explanation of 1, how we can know truly, 2, how we can err, and 3, how we can critically distinguish truth from error. One thing I love about Whitehead is, when I'm calling deceptively bland, the way, he actually restates and refocuses a problem by saying it in what seems to be very kind of bland, anodyne, inoffensive language. It's actually a very brilliant rhetorical tool, which I've come to appreciate more and more. Anyway, because the point is that despite this unexceptional goal of differentiating truth from error and knowing for sure, Whitehead does not seem to think that the problem of error is of great importance. Indeed, he takes what most philosophers would consider a cavalier and indeed irresponsible attitude toward the whole question, for he holds that, as he famously wrote in Process and Reality, in the real world, it is more important that a proposition be interesting than that it be true. A scientific observation, a common sense hypothesis, or even a rigorous philosophical formulation may have relevant and important consequences, despite the fact that it's erroneous. For this reason, Whitehead is less concerned with eliminating error than in experimenting with it and seeing what might arise from it. Error for Whitehead is not an evil to be exterminated, but a frequently useful lure for feeling. It is a productive detour in the pathways of mental life. And as he says again in Symbolism, we must not, however, judge too severely of error. In the initial stages of mental progress, error in symbolic reference is the discipline which promotes imaginative freedom. It's worth underlining how rare this position is in Western philosophy. It may well be a cliche of educational method, a subject in which Whitehead, of course, was very deeply interested in, though in the new volume, The Lure of Whitehead, there was an article by James Williams, which talks about Whitehead's book about education. And there may be other things I don't know about. It's the first thing I've read which really dealt in a really powerful, interesting way with that education volume. But anyway, my point is that Whitehead was interested in education. It may be a cliche of educational method that, the student has to make errors as part of learning. But most mainstream philosophers overlook this. They're more concerned with the nature and content of truth than they are with the question of how we may learn to attain it. The result is important. The method is to get to the result, but the error in the method doesn't seem to concern them. As far as I know, really, Gilles Deleuze is the only other major philosopher who joins Whitehead in regarding the problem of error itself as merely trivial. Western philosophy in general is so preoccupied with the question of error because it is deeply concerned with the unreliability of immediate experience, or of the body and the senses. From Plato's allegory of the cave through Descartes' radical doubt about the evidence provided by his physical organs, right on up to Thomas Metzinger, the contemporary philosopher who claims that experience is nothing but an internal virtual reality simulation. Throughout this whole history, philosophers have been haunted by the idea that sense perception is delusional, and that as a result our beliefs about the world might well be radically wrong. Even if we trust the evidence of our senses, however, we may still be severely limited in the extent of what we can actually know. And this is really where Whitehead's commentary in Symbolism begins. Hume is skeptical not so much of the deliverance of the senses themselves as of what we can legitimately infer from them. For Hume, this is a quote from the Enquiry, all events seem entirely loose and separate. One event follows another, but we never can observe any tie between them. They seem conjoined, but never connected. It's true that we often observe, to paraphrase, it's true that we often observe the constant conjunction of certain events, but correlation is not causation, and Hume insists we cannot legitimately infer from the former to the latter. Hume concludes that, another quote, the idea of a necessary connection among events arises only because the mind is carried by habit, end of quote, to expect a second associated event when it encounters the first. Now Kant, of course, since Symbolism really talks about Hume and Kant as the two main theorists with whom Whitehead is concerned to argue, endeavors to overcome Hume's skepticism by means of a transcendental argument. We cannot do without causality. If relations of cause and effect cannot be found in sense data themselves, as Hume maintains, then Kant concludes that it must inhere in our ways of thought about the data. That's what Whitehead says about Kant. For Kant, causality is rescued as an a priori category of the understanding. If we were not able to organize the sense data we would receive, according to the laws of cause and effect, Kant says, then we would scarcely be able to have subjective experience at all. Now, as far as I know, from my admittedly incomplete knowledge, recent philosophy most often treats causality in a Humean spirit rather than a Kantian one. Thus, the late analytic philosopher David K. Lewis maintains that, and this is a quote from Lewis, all there is to the world is a vast mosaic of local matters of particular fact, just one little thing and then another. That's a quote. Relations of cause and effect may be observed to supervene upon these particular facts, but Lewis argues, following Hume, that we cannot make any inference from such observations to a deeper sort of necessity. For we can always imagine, without logical contradiction, counterfactual possible worlds in which events could have turned out differently. Analytic philosophers in general love to float scenarios in which, for instance, water is not composed of H2O, which, as Hilary Putnam does in Meaning and Reference, or in which people devoid of sentience nonetheless act in ways that are indistinguishable from everyone else, which is David Chalmers' zombie hypothesis. Lewis's modal realism asserts that we must accept the reality of all these alternative possible worlds. Now, Jeff Bell's written about this on his blog, and he's noted also that there's a certain similarity between Lewis's doctrine of Humean supervenience and the revival by the speculative realist philosopher Kenton Meillassoux of what he calls Hume's problem. For Meillassoux, Hume establishes once and for all that neither experience, which only pertains to the past and present, never to the future, nor a priori reasoning, which can only exclude logical contradictions, is able to guarantee the necessity of causal relations. For, Meillassoux writes, there is nothing contradictory in thinking that the same causes could produce different effects tomorrow, unquote. If the prospect of arbitrary change is not impossible, Meillassoux argues, then it cannot be excluded from the world as it is. So the contrast is that where Lewis affirms the reality of all possible worlds, Meillassoux argues for the absolute necessity of contingency or all possibilities, sheer and granted possibility in this, our own world. Now, this brings us, I think, to Whitehead's critique of both Hume and Kant, which I think still applies to a lot of contemporary. Actually, in my book I just published, The Universe of Things, I talk a little about realism about powers and causes, which you find in the analytic philosophy of George Molnar, and more recently Stephen Mumford and Rani Lil Anjem, who follow Molnar closely. And I find their realism about causes to be very relevant here. But in fact, in Mumford and Anjem's book, they mentioned Whitehead once or twice, and they said Whitehead wrote it was so difficult and ambiguous we never really know what he meant. In their analytic philosophers, they want everything to be clear and unambiguous. But in fact, they are espousing a view which seems to me to be in many ways close to Whitehead's, even though it's not clear that they know this. Anyway, Whitehead rejects the presupposition. Okay, Hume and Kant alike, as well as their followers, share what Whitehead calls, another quote, the naive presupposition of simple occurrence for the mere data, or better, of simple locations, since it applies to space as well as time. It little matters to Whitehead, therefore, whether causal efficacy is defined with Hume as a habit of thought or with Kant as a category of thought. In cases, relations and forms of organization are abstracted away from the matrix of things themselves and attributed only to the mind that observes these things. Whitehead writes, both schools find causal efficacy to the importation into the data of a way of thinking or judging about those data. Whitehead, however, rejects the presuppositions that underlie this whole history of argument. For Whitehead denies that events in themselves are ever merely loose and separate, the Hume phrase, whether the world can be reduced to local matters of particular fact, the David Lewis phrase. In the actual world, Whitehead says, there is nothing which simply happens. There are no isolated data because in every act of experience, as he says in Process and Reality, the datum includes its own interconnections already. In order to explain how this works, Whitehead distinguishes, and this is the famous distinction which is the main body of symbolism, between two separate modes of perceptive experience, presentational immediacy and causal efficacy. These two modes, together with the ways that they are fused in symbolic reference, form the main subject of symbolism. The distinction between these two modes is further elaborated in Price's Reality. So, even though this is a conference about symbolism, I'm going to talk about the two modes, not about their combination in symbolism, which I'm going to sort of leave aside for other people to talk about, or which, okay, but anyway. As far as I can tell, presentational immediacy roughly corresponds to Descartes' clear and distinct perceptions, to Hume's impressions, and to Kant's sensible intuitions. Whitehead defines it as, quote, our immediate perception of the contemporary external world, unquote, an appearance which is, another quote, effected by the mediation of qualities such as colors, sounds, tastes, etc. So presentational immediacy is a great source of sensuous richness, but it only provides us with clearly demarcated representations and is confined to the present moment without any thickness of duration. For these reasons, presentational immediacy is severely limited in what it reveals of the world. As Whitehead says, presentational immediacy is vivid, precise, and barren. Yet another quote, displays a world concealed under an adventitious show, a show of our own bodily production. But for this very reason, it leaves us with a hollow sense of depthless mere appearances. This is the root of philosophical skepticism in Hume and throughout modernity. According to Whitehead, the problem with standard philosophical accounts of perception is that these accounts are only concerned with presentational immediacy. They entirely ignore other modes of experience. They take it for granted that our empirical experience is limited to individual sense expressions, which is where we get the local matters of particular facts that would correspond to these impressions. This assumption is what allows Hume to argue that objects are nothing more than hypothetical bundles of qualities. It's also what drives Kant to conclude that only the mind can bring order to what would otherwise be a chaos of unrelated impressions. Whitehead, however, suggests that Hume and Kant don't even give presentational immediacy its proper due, for he insists that even if we restrict ourselves to just this mode of perception, here's a quote, the world discloses itself to be a community of actual things which are actual in the same sense as we are. When we're looking at a wall, for instance, another quote, Our perception is not confined to universal characters. We do not perceive disembodied color or disembodied extensiveness. We perceive the wall's color and extensiveness, end of quote. What this means is that for Whitehead, contrary to the empiricist assumption of separate atomistic qualia, in fact, even in presentational immediacy, there are no bare sensations which are first experienced and then projected into our feet as their feelings or onto the opposite wall as its color. The supposedly atomistic qualitative sense data are not initially isolated from one another. Rather, Whitehead says, such qualities, again I quote, can be thus isolated only by abstracting them from their implication in the scheme of spatial relatedness of the perceived things to each other and to the perceiving subject. The sense data are generic abstractions. Okay, another sort of digression into speculative realism. It's worth noting that Graham Harman, with his object-oriented ontology, also opposes what he describes as the widespread empiricist view that the supposed objects of experience are nothing but bundles of qualities. It's a quote from Harman. Harman rather insists that qualities are never isolable, but always, quote, bonded to the thing to which they belong. Now, Harman attributes this point to Husserl, for whom an intentional object is not the sum of its adumbrations, but always more than its multiple aspects or qualities. Another quote from Harman. According to Husserl, we encounter the intentional object directly in experience from the start. It does not have to be built up as a bundle of perceptually discrete shapes and colors, or even from tiny pixels of sense experience woven together by habit. So that's Harman on what he sees as Husserl's anti-empiricism. Now, my reason for mentioning this is that Whitehead makes the same distinction as Husserl does, at least according to Harman's reading of Husserl. Whitehead most likely makes this point without having encountered it in Husserl. It's true that Whitehead had students, most notably Charles Hartshorne, who had also studied with Husserl and were familiar with his writings. But I at least don't see any evidence for Husserl's influence upon Whitehead, even when, as here, they come to parallel conclusions. Now, this is a sort of a side thing, which maybe I should have left out, but I'll just state it briefly. I don't have the space here to really think about the comparison between phenomenology and Whitehead's theory of perception, and that's obviously a vast subject and would be a whole talk in itself. I will say quite flatly what my ideas about this are, but I won't offer any proof because there's no time. For me, one great advantage of Whitehead's formulations is precisely that they come without the philosophical baggage of intentionality and Husserl's epoche. Such basic notions of phenomenology are still, I think, most obviously they're still centered upon a transcendental subject. But beyond this, I would even argue, though I'm well aware how controversial this is, that despite Husserl's theory of retention and protension, this phenomenological accounts of perception in time still don't give a full enough account of the thickness of what William James and Whitehead following call the specious present. Phenomenologists are well aware of the defects of what Whitehead calls the naive assumption of time as pure succession. But I would want to question whether a theory based in intentionality is able, and protension and retention is able to actually overcome this. And I'd argue that it doesn't, because it's still assuming the mode of presentational immediacy, even though, like Whitehead, it gives a richer description of presentational immediacy than standard empiricism does. But that's just a really side note. Be that as it may, for Whitehead, the major defect in mainstream philosophical accounts of perception is that they leave out any consideration of causal efficacy. The physical sciences, on the other hand, are predominantly concerned with causal efficacy, but they treat it only as an objectified process comprehended by a view from nowhere. In this way, you might say that the split between presentational immediacy and causal efficacy is a prime instance of what Whitehead calls the bifurcation of nature. The scientists, no less than the philosophers, would neglect causal efficacy as a mode of perception in the manner Whitehead does, or as a mode of experience. So you can have one or the other. The science has causal efficacy, but it doesn't treat it as perception. Phenomenology has perception, but it doesn't treat it in relation to causality. It's only by treating causal efficacy experientially and understanding how it becomes entwined with presentational immediacy in the operative symbolic reference that we can overcome the opposition between phenomenology on one hand and natural science on the other, or between, to use one of Whitehead's many formulations on the concept of nature, the nature apprehended in awareness and nature which is the cause of awareness. So, again, there's a hidden polemic here, or not so hidden polemic, but one which I realize I'm not giving justice to, which is that Whitehead offers something very different from a phenomenology, and it has to do with I have a general polemic that phenomenology is inadequate. But again, I don't think I'm capable of debating it at this point, and it's more a hunch than something I've really worked out. But anyway, Whitehead goes to great lengths in symbolism to argue not only that causal efficacy is a mode of perception, but also that it's the most primordial mode of perception, far deeper than presentational immediacy. The latter is only of importance in high-grade organisms, but the direct perception of causal efficacy, Whitehead says, operates everywhere, for for it involves the overwhelming confirmation of fact in present action to antecedent settled fact. Indeed, Whitehead says, the perception of confirmation to realities in the environment is the primitive element in our external experience. We conform to our bodily organs and to the vague world which lies beyond them. Without this confirmation of the present to the past, this physical experience of causal efficacy, the clarities and intensities of, without this confirmation of the past which characterizes causal efficacy, then the clarities and intensity of present immediacy could not even arise for us in the first place. Even our most clear and distinct perceptions are grounded in a deeper sense that is vague, haunting, and unmanageable. Our very awareness of sharp and delicious sensations and our ability to make subtle discriminations among them, what Whitehead describes as our self-enjoyment derived from the immediacy of the show of things, is underwritten and made possible by the perception of the pressure from a world of things with characters in their own right, characters mysteriously molding our own natures. Those are all quotes. A heavy otherness insinuates itself into even our clearest and most distinct perceptions, which is why there can be no solipsism of the present moment. And part of what I'm trying to get at here is that, Whitehead has polemic about, in Symbolism, about the defects of presentational immediacy as taken by philosophers to be the only mode of perception. But obviously Whitehead isn't against either of these two modes. I think it would be more interesting to work out how an aesthetic, the aesthetic of presentational immediacy is very different from presentational immediacy seen as a source of epistemological doubt, and also, again, maybe distinguishing the aesthetic of causal efficacy from the scientific objective description of causal efficacy. I think you need, that'll get me into a 2x2 greater fourfold if I'm not careful, so I'll drop that for now. But anyway, the massive underlying pressure of causal efficacy is also what produces and accounts for our apprehension of things as more than just bundles of qualities. Again, and Whitehead says, in Symbolism, these primitive emotions are accompanied by the clearest recognition of other actual things reacting upon ourselves. The vulgar obviousness of such recognition is equal to the vulgar obviousness produced by the functioning of any one of our five senses. When we hate, it is a man that we hate and not a collection of sense data, a causal efficacious man. I love that phrase. Anyway, so the vagueness of the emotional experience of causal efficacy does not prevent, or rather actually calls forth an awareness that things actually do exist outside us and apart from us. In other words, we encounter the object directly in experience from the start, as Harman insists, rather than building up a representation of the object from a bundle of separate sense impressions. My direct experience of the object in the mode of causal efficacy subtends my identification of it in the mode of presentational immediacy. And it is only by abstracting away from causal efficacy that we can enjoy the subtle and disinterested aesthetic pleasures of presentational immediacy. This is why, this is why, following Whitehead, and as I outline in my new book, The Universe of Things, following Whitehead, I dissent from Harman's insistence that real objects cannot touch and that causation can only be vicarious. For this is only the case from the viewpoint of presentational immediacy. In causal efficacy, objects do literally touch one another. The immediacy of touch follows directly from the principle of confirmation, quote from Whitehead, whereby what is already made becomes a determinant of what is in the making. The present fact is luminously the outcome from its predecessors 1/4 of a second ago. So the principle of confirmation applies equally to my own continuity with who I was 1/4 of a second ago, and to my contact with things that have impinged upon me in the past 1/4 second. Harman worries that all distinction would be lost if actual contact were possible. He argues that the idea of indirect and partial contact cannot work. Direct contact can only be all or nothing. That's Harman in his sternest mode. Harman's problem is to maintain separation at the same time that he accounts for causal influence. As Harman puts it, even when fire burns cotton, there is no direct contact between these two entities. The fire will obliterate the cotton with no remainder, but even then, as Harman says, fire does not interact at all with such qualities as the cotton's odor or color. Therefore, Harman argues, fire and cotton remain ontologically separate in accordance with his dictum that the object is a dark crystal veiled in a private vacuum. Now, Isabel Stengers insists that Whitehead always works as a mathematician, even when he's engaged in philosophical speculation. Whitehead does not posit absolute principles. Rather, he always confronts specific problems by producing a construction that observes all the constraints that the solution will have to satisfy, quoting from Thinking with Whitehead. In this sense, I would argue that Whitehead's distinction between the two modes of sense perception is itself constructed as a way to resolve the problem of error, which I mentioned at the beginning, and of skepticism about causality that are found in both the Humean and the Kantian traditions. And in addition, I would like to say that this resolves Harman's problem about causality, which I think results from his intrication through Husserl and Heidegger with those traditions. Harman argues that at one and the same time, Whitehead argues that at one and the same time, actual things are objectively in our experience and formally existing in their own completeness. No actual thing is objectified in its formal completeness. And this is another example of something else I generally love in Whitehead. He takes old or even superannuated, used up philosophical vocabulary and repurposes it for new aims. And that's, one of the many wonderful things about him, and that's what he's doing here. By making this distinction between objective and formal being, he's able to insert both. One, that things actually do enter in direct contact with other things, so they partially determine the composition of each other things. And two, that no particular thing is entirely subsumed either by the other things that entered into it and helped it to determine its own composition, nor by the other things into which it subsequently enters. In this way, Whitehead's construction satisfies ahead of time all the conditions of Harman's problem, without accepting Harman's vision of objects as inviolable substances. And note in passing that another speculative realist philosopher, Tristan Garcia, whose French book Form and Object was recently translated by John Cogburn and somebody else, is very much concerned with this. He offers a philosophy of objects very similar to Harman in some ways, but he describes a thing as the difference between that which is in the thing and that which the thing is in, or that in which the thing is. It works better in French than in English. But basically, the difference in what enters into a thing and what the thing enters into is what the thing itself is. It can't be said possibly, but it has to be done through this distinction. That seems to me to have some formal resemblance to Whitehead's somewhat more elegant formulation. But the larger point here, and what I really want to get to, is that causal efficacy is at the same time a mode of perception and an actual physical process. It encompasses both the perceived redness and warmth of the fire and the agitated molecules of carbon and oxygen. In this double functioning, causal efficacy is irreducible both to rigid determinism and to philosophical skepticism. Whitehead notes, for instance, that Hume's presuppositions contradict his assertion that causal efficacy cannot be directly perceived. And this is another quote from Symbolism. Hume, with the clarity of genius, states the fundamental point that sense data functioning in an active experience demonstrate that they are given by the causal efficacy of actual bodily organs. He refers to this causal efficacy as a component in direct perception. That is to say, on Whitehead's reading, then by Hume's own prior admission, we get direct acquaintance with the world through the actions of the body. In asserting the lack of perception of causality, Hume implicitly presupposes it, Whitehead writes. His argument presupposes that sense data functioning in presentational immediacy are given by reason of eyes, ears, palates functioning in causal efficacy. More generally, Whitehead says, we see the picture and we see it with our eyes. We touch the wood and we touch it with our hands. We smell the rose and we smell it with our nose. We hear the bell and we hear it with our ears. We taste the sugar and we taste it with our palate. That's again from Symbolism, but he says similar things in Process and Reality and elsewhere. The functioning here of experience in the mode of causal efficacy is antecedent to and necessary for the very experience in the mode of presentational immediacy within which Hume says no causation can be discerned. Whitehead recapitulates and expands his critique of Hume in Process and Reality, and again, he says there, it's difficult to understand why Hume exempts habit from the same criticism as that applied to the notion of cause. We have no impression of habit just as we have no impression of cause. Cause, repetition, habit are all in the same boat. Once again, Whitehead argues that Hume presupposes the power of causal efficacy in the very attempt to explain it away. And I'm tempted to describe Whitehead's mode of argument here as a kind of weird inversion of Kant's mode of argument. Kant opposes Hume by insisting that we cannot in principle escape causality because it must be imposed transcendently from above. We couldn't have experience unless we did this. Whitehead instead opposes Hume by opposing that in point of fact we do not escape causality because it is always already at work empirically from below. So if you want, you might say that Whitehead turns Kant around and puts him on his feet in the same way that Marx claimed to put Hegel on his feet. Though I should mention that Deleuze already claimed that Nietzsche did that to Kant, but whatever. Whitehead shows that causal efficacy is always already at work in our perception as a physical function of the bodily organs. This would remain the case even if we were brains in vats getting delusive sense impressions by means of direct stimulation of the neurons. The actual physical functioning of causal efficacy must still be presupposed, even if the picture presented through presentational immediacy does not correspond to an actual state of affairs in the world. This is why Whitehead says that direct experience in itself is infallible. This assertion is in fact a tautology, as he continues in Symbolism. What you have experienced, you have experienced. The delusion of a brain in vats, like the delusion exhibited in Aesop's fable of the dog who dropped a piece of meat to grasp at its reflection in the water, another quote from Symbolism, is a failure of symbolic reference rather than of direct experience in itself. It results not from any defect of perception per se, but from the way in which the various actualities disclosed respectively by the two modes are either identified or at least correlated together as interrelated elements in our environment. In other words, the dog's error is a mistake of interpretation or a failure to respect the limits of abstraction. Whitehead tells us, of course, that we cannot live without making abstractions, even though we go wrong when we take our abstractions too seriously or push them beyond the limits within which they are useful. That's the famous fallacy of misplaced concreteness. And we find it at work equally in dogs' misjudgment about meat and in the most refined examples of philosophical reasoning. It is not the perception of meat in the water that is at fault, but rather the dog's failure to understand that this meat, which he truly perceived, is a reflection rather than an edible substance. This is why Whitehead remains, as I mentioned before, so relaxed in his treatment of error. Aesop's dog lost his meat, but he gained a step on the road towards a free imagination. And I think of this a lot with my dog, but I'm not sure my dog's gotten there yet. We experience causal efficacy not only because we are bodies, but also because we feel and subsist within the passage of time. Whitehead argues that Hume's skeptical conclusions rest upon an extraordinarily naive assumption of time as pure succession. I should say it always makes me uncomfortable whenever anybody uses the word naive as a critique. And this is actually something that Graham Harman said. Graham Harman said whenever anybody criticizes naive realism, as a lot of people did in the 1990s, especially in literary circles I used to move in, it was really a rhetorical ploy, because it wasn't that you need a non-naive informed realism, it was that all realism is naive. So there's a problem with calling something naive, so I'm sorry that Whitehead uses that word, but he does. But anyway, the notion of pure succession, or time as an empty form, is an abstraction from the irreversible relationship of settled past to derivative present, Whitehead writes. In actual concrete experience, we feel time as the derivation of state from state, with the latter state exhibiting conformity to the antecedent. The past consists of a community of settled acts which, through their objectifications in the present act, establish the conditions to which the act must conform. Now, of course, you could say a lot more about that, because that's where Whitehead says it's always a matter of decision. You can make a decision in a vacuum, but the decision has to conform to certain conditions. But of course, he also argues that the conditions don't absolutely determine and take away the decision by determining what has to happen. But that, in other words, experience does not only happen in the present moment in the now, it also comprehends the past and projects toward the future. And again, it seems to me this is more, I won't get into the argument here, but I would like to argue at some point, if I can ever work myself into it, that this is a richer and thicker way of thinking about it than phenomenology offers us. But again, we can leave that aside. Even the most primitive living organisms have a sense for the fate from which they have emerged and for the fate towards which they go. Another quote. Time is not so much the measure of change as the force of conformation. And it's only against the background of this force of conformation that change is even possible. And another quote I really like from Symbolism. The present fact is luminously the outcome from its predecessors 1/4 of a second ago. Unsuspected factors may have intervened. Dynamite may have exploded. But however that may be, the present event issues subject to the limitations laid upon it by the actual nature of the immediate past. If dynamite explodes, then present fact is that issue from the past which is consistent with dynamite exploding. So this reminds me of, I'm also a film scholar, this reminds me of Hitchcock's distinction between suspense and surprise, both of which he employed in different films. Surprise is when a dynamite suddenly explodes and the protagonist is killed, or when the seeming main character is killed in Psycho. Suspense is when the dynamite's under the table and you're just waiting at the edge of your seats. Is it going to explode? Are they going to get out of time? Is it going to explode? So, they're two different, Hitchcock did both, they're two different things. But anyway, in this way, perception and judgment are themselves temporal instances. They're nested within the broad span of confirmation or causal influence. To perceive something is to be affected, and then this is, I think, the deeper point I've been trying to get to through all this. To perceive something is to be affected or influenced by that something. And willed action, or more generally what Whitehead in Process and Reality calls decision, can itself only take place within a given framework of causal efficacy. This is the source of Whitehead's distinction in Symbolism between pure potentiality and natural potentiality, which is recast in Process and Reality as a distinction between general potentiality and real potentiality. Pure or general potentiality is mere logical possibility, while natural or real potentiality takes account of stubborn fact, or the actual components which are given for experience. One might compare this to using a different vocabulary, Deleuze's distinction between virtuality and possibility. But that's, again, another discussion. From Whitehead's point of view, David Lewis's modal realism and Meillassoux principle of contingency both fail because they ignore this distinction. Since they only recognize presentational immediacy, they abstract the mere lapse of time from the more concrete relatedness of confirmation. In consequence, they regard sheer logical possibility as if it were real potential. According to Hume, Whitehead says, there are no stubborn facts, and the same must be said for Lewis and for Meillassoux. The error of these great thinkers, you might say, results precisely from their endeavor to eliminate error on grounds of epistemological consistency. And this, again, gets the other crux of what I'm trying to get at. For the mainstream of modern Western philosophy, Causality is an example of a relation that must be put into doubt because it is supposedly not given in perception. Whitehead counters this by showing that causality is not just an abstract condition for perceptive experience, which Kant had argued already, but also an actually given component of experience. Causal efficacy is in fact directly experienced, but beyond this, experience of any sort mysteriously depends upon the functioning of causal efficacy. In this way, causality is more than just an example of something whose status in perception we may argue about. In fact, it is central to the whole theory of perception. Perception itself a sort of causal relation, rather than causal relations being instances that we may perceive or not. In this way, Whitehead's account of causal efficacy provides a bridge from epistemology to ontology, or to what Whitehead calls cosmology. For Hume, Kant, and their modern successors, we cannot talk about causality without first accounting for how we know that causal relations between ostensibly independent entities can exist. But Whitehead argues that even to raise the question of how we know is already to have accepted the operation of causal efficacy in the form of the confirmation of present fact to immediate past. Whitehead thus, I think, cuts the Gordian knot of Kantian critique. He frees speculation from the grim Kantian alternative of one, being subjected to critique, which is, say, prior epistemological legitimation, or two, being rejected as simply dogmatic. It should be noted that Meillassoux also seeks to escape this infernal alternative. He claims to establish the possibility of non-dogmatic speculation as a way of stepping outside the Kantian correlation circle without thereby regressing to a pre-critical dogmatic philosophy. And Whitehead does say that it regresses. He writes at the beginning of Process and Reality that his philosophy is a recurrence to that phase of philosophical thought which began with Descartes and ended with Hume. Nonetheless, I would argue with Stengers that Whitehead's proposal is a constructivist one which cannot be characterized as dogmatic in the pejorative Kantian sense. Rather, his speculative flight, I'm going to skip over a little bit. Basically, I'm arguing here that Whitehead offers a kind of speculation, a renewed ability of speculation after the Kantian critique of speculation, precisely by the way he creates a kind of chiasmus between ontology and epistemology, because you can't have epistemology first without ontology. Again, I know he doesn't use the word ontology, but because in a certain sense causality is both, or causality is where the two cross into each other, to even establish something in epistemology, you're already committed to a kind of ontology. And he mentions, and this, so there's a kind of chiasmatic loop between perception and causality, and that's really what I'm trying to get at. And this relates to my book where I try to give a Whiteheadian perspective on speculative realism. I think that Whitehead anticipates many of the goals of speculative realists, but he offers an alternative either to Meillassoux' ultra-rationalism or to Harman's post-phenomenology. I'll conclude by just very briefly mentioning some further consequences of this discussion. Whitehead argues both that causal efficacy is directly perceived and that causal confirmation of the present to the immediate past is a general process. There is therefore a curious chiasmus between perception and causality, in kind of a feedback loop. This also implies, among other things, that there is no clear dividing line between perception proper and causal influence more generally. I perceive something whenever I'm affected by that something, even in cases where this does not happen consciously. For instance, Whitehead writes in Symbolism, the human body is causally affected by the ultraviolet rays of the solar spectrum in ways which do not issue in any sensation of color. Nevertheless, such rays produce a decided emotional effect. So, in other words, Whitehead is both saying that there's no clear line between perception and a form of scientific causal influence which is not perceived, which is not directly perceived, or not presentationally immediate. In fact, our perception is this one kind of ways in which we're affected by other things. And he claims it's not just a scientific process, but also as an emotional effect. This emotional effect may well be a modulation of my mood. I always feel better when I am outdoors on a sunny day, or when I visit Claremont instead of the cloudy skies where I live. But it may also consist of my getting suntanned or sunburned, or even developing skin cancer. Any physical response to this sort is in some sense an emotional response as well, and a form of perception. Even below the threshold of consciousness, a physical change is also a change of some sort in affective tone. And this is not only the case for human experience, but for all other organisms. A lot of this has been covered in recent writings on Whitehead under the rubric of what he calls an advantage of his non-sensuous perception. So very quickly, I'll mention two other things which I think follow from this. One is a dispute about how we understand causal efficacy or non-sensuous perception. This is in a book by Mark Hansen, the media theorist, which I've read in advance, which is coming out, I think, in January. Hansen argues that Whitehead is peculiarly relevant to understanding media in the 21st century because these media, in the form of things like physical sensors in the environment, often have perceptions or give us information of perceptions which we cannot consciously perceive. And I think he has some very interesting readings of Whitehead in relation to this. somewhat unfortunately to my mind, who contains extremely vigorous polemics, basically against me and all my friends for our readings of Whitehead, which clearly I have a little bit of resentment about. But I really don't think, but I really don't think. I really think that I really like to see conciliation rather than make it a contrast rather than an opposition. I think Hansen is too. I mean, Hansen draws on two very good readings of Whitehead by Judith Jones and by Jorge Novo, but I don't think these are as radically inconciliable with many of my friends' readings of Whitehead as he seems to say. But I still think I think his extension of Whitehead to understand how media which operate below the threshold of perception work is valuable and important. Okay, and the last thing I want to say very quickly has to do with Whitehead's panpsychism or panexperientialism, to use David Ray Griffin's word, which is more polite than my using of panpsychism. I think that thinking about sentience in this way, thinking about causality and perception as being on the continuum, or as perception being a subset of as causality, or them crossing over with each other, is a good way of getting around a lot of problems which come up, I think, both rhetorically and conceptually in trying to thematize the notion of life. This is a problem with vitalist philosophies, even not only 19th century ones, but even contemporary ones, like those deriving from Deleuze, which try to think of a pan-vitalism, not vitalism as something that separates living things from non-living things, but that all entities possess. There's still a problem with thematizing life, which has to do with the difference between instances and a category. Eugene Thacker, in his book Afterlife, I think, is an extensive and very powerful, brilliant study of this problem. Trying to theorize life and to differentiate between life with a capital L and individual things which have the property of being alive in some sense always come to grief, and there are serious problems there. I suggest that thinking through sentience and causality as this kind of continuum might be a way around that. So that's why I think the panpsychist or pan-experientialist thesis we get from Whitehead is maybe better than the pan-vitalist principle we get from Deleuze. Okay, thank you.
We have a good 20 minutes for questions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you, Stephen. I really enjoyed that. I
Thanks.
think you're right on almost everything. I have just one question, maybe just to help you clarify some a bit more. You mentioned in passing at one point about presentational immediacy.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, I think, in the context of art. And,
Yeah.
And at the time, it brought to mind the passage from the Symbolism book, where Whitehead talks about his friend, the artist, who tried to block the influence from seeing the chair.
That's great.
And thinking of the chair, and how that naturally you see a chair, you think, oh, I'm going to sit down and relax.
And the puppy dog does too. I mean,
so that seems to be the causal efficacy there, right? This confirmation of past experience with our presentational immediacy. So in order to get to presentational immediacy, it requires a tremendous amount of work. But that seems to be where the artists focus. At least the example of bringing in an artist there seems interesting because.
Well, that's a great. I mean, I don't have an answer to that. I think that's really important, and it should be added to what I just said. It relates to a larger issue I have, which is in my last book. I talk a lot about aesthetics, and Harman says in one of his essays that we should consider aesthetics to be first philosophy.
Right.
And I kind of agree with him, though I have a different account of aesthetics than he does.
Yeah.
But that's why I was trying to say in part, which I was just commenting, wasn't in my written text, about how you might think of both of these two modes, and as aesthetically as well as in other ways.
And that's because I was like, because we all know that Whitehead was interested in the new creative process.
Well, yeah, but Whitehead. I mean, it's more. I think Whitehead is very concerned with this polemic against the philosophical error of seeing only presentational immediacy.
Yes. No,
But I mean, I don't think that means we say, oh, we hate presentational immediacy. Only causal efficacy is really where it's at, or something like that. I mean, but so he doesn't really bring that back when he talks about beauty in the latter part of Adventures of Ideas, as far as I can recall.
Yeah.
But it might be a place where those things might well be put together.
Yeah, Michael?
There were 4 things which came up, but I'll only do 2. Can I do a point of clarification as well?
Yeah.
Thank you, because as ever, you made me think. I'm going to say something, and tell me if I'm wrong. If I was, I do agree with you. Could we then be suggesting that the problem of causation is one which has arisen in the mode of presentational immediacy, which means that you don't solve that problem by bringing in causal efficacy. You completely recast the problem. So causal efficacy isn't causal in the sense that we've thought of causation in the mode of presentational immediacy. And that's why confirmation becomes so important. You're frowning at me.
I'm not sure. I'm just trying to think of your message. Yeah, I'm not sure whether I'd agree. I mean, maybe. I'm not sure I'd phrase it that way.
Okay.
I think it's more like, I'm trying to think of it as different. I mean, in a way, it's a kind of immanentization or detranscendentalization of Kant. So Kant says, we couldn't be having these experiences if we didn't have causality. And in a certain sense, Whitehead's saying that too, but not as an a priori transcendental necessity or something imposed by our minds, but as sort of the context in which, in other words, for both Kant and Whitehead, it's the context in which the question can only be asked in the first place. But Whitehead's giving a kind of more naturalistic account of that, rather than he's trying to avoid making it into a kind of transcendental condition of experience, I think. And Whitehead doesn't explicitly write about this, but this is why I see Whitehead as very relevant to contemporary attempts to think, get away from transcendental frameworks.
Okay, I mean, maybe
I'm not sure if that answers you.
I think I was trying to suggest that, because within that, I thought what you were saying was actually talking about the collation of subjective experience.
Yeah.
So if the whole problem of causality is, and our understanding of what constitutes the problem has been set up in such a way.
Yes, I mean, we wouldn't worry about it if not for this abstraction and isolation of presence of immediacy. It would never occur to anybody to worry about it if not for that, is I think what Whitehead's saying.
Yes, so his solution is even more peculiar than sometimes I think.
Maybe. I'm not sure.
The other thing was simply Badiou.
Yeah.
We were talking about just before. In his later books, at least, describes what he does as objective phenomenology, which I've always thought of as a nice way of thinking about the difference between Whitehead and phenomenology. So you think about the
again, I don't know. I have a lot of phenomenologist friends, especially in film criticism and theory, and so I'm always bouncing ideas off them or arguing with them as privileged debating partners. So in a way, I have more students than people I wouldn't even talk to in the first place because they're so much further away. But
so I'm just thinking about process and reality. If you just think of experiences and the sort of pan-experientialism. Yeah, but
I think, it goes back to the bifurcation of nature and the concept of nature. I mean, it seems to me that one way to read that is that phenomenologists, from Husserl through Merleau-Ponty down to the present, sort of say, well, of course the experience of the sunset comes first, and the atoms and photons streaming from the sun are secondary. It's only through our perception that we can posit them. But the Whitehead wouldn't disagree with that, but he would say, I take it, that the phenomenologist's dismissal, therefore, of the scientific as secondary and only privileging the phenomenological experience of the sunset is reductive in its own way, in the same way that the scientist says, oh, your experiences are just nonsense, it's really just photons are. I really take seriously that to get over the bifurcation of nature is not to re-enchant the world by making subjective the experiential again, but by really having that they're both in the same boat together, as he frequently says. So, I don't know whether I've succeeded in articulating how that works to my own satisfaction, but that seems to be the goal, and that seems to me a way in which I'm pushing back against some recent attempts to really sort of snuggle up Whitehead with Merleau-Ponty, basically. Yeah.
So this is, in a sense, a minor question, but it's the point where some of my obsessions come to bear.
With mine.
With yours.
Mine,
So you have this great phrasing where you characterize causal efficacy as at one and the same time a mode of perception and actual physical process, right? Now, the question I have is, are you at all concerned about this thing that's developed where physical is such a strange word? Because it could mean the world of physics.
Yeah.
Or it could incorporate physiology. And I take it mostly you're using it here in the sense of physiology.
I think I mean to use it both. I mean,
But does the word itself kind of push the physiology to one side?
I don't think so. I mean, again, I'm partly drawing here implicitly on, this is something I talk about briefly in my book, but on the analytic philosopher Galen Strawson, who's one of the strong advocates of panpsychism. And he starts out by saying, I'm a physicalist. Now, this is a word which all the analytic reductionist philosophers use. And he says, I'm a monist. I don't believe there's anything else, there's anything spiritual which is separate from the material world. I believe everything is physical. But since I don't think consciousness is eliminable from the world, he says, therefore, consciousness must be physical, therefore it must be a property of matter. Now, obviously, it's a more complex line of argument than that. But again, he's trying to resist any kind of dualism which would come by saying, there's something about inner experience or, consciousness which is transcendent to material reality. He even entertained, he quotes at one point Russell, who sort of says that, the outside of the atom is what physics says, we don't know what's inside the atom.
But again, that's reducing physiology to physics.
No, I think they're both, I don't think it's a reduction. I think they're both there.
I don't believe in reducing it, but I'm saying.
No, I don't think.
The language you're using there to describe.
You're right. Maybe I should try to clarify the language. What I want to say, I don't think that it's, I'm not saying it's all quarks and photons rather than, my body and my hand and my eyes. There are lots of arguments which would say that, again, it's like analytic philosophy has done so much on whole questions of reductionism and that I don't feel I have a full grasp of it. But one of the arguments made is that you can cheerfully say, yeah, my body's made out of atoms, which are also made out of quarks and leptons and things like that. But that doesn't mean that a description of my body in terms of quarks and leptons would somehow be a better description than my description of my body in terms of seeing something. Adam?
I just have a question. I want you to, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you said about Eugene Thacker. Because I'm a little surprised, actually, that you're citing Eugene Thacker in the way in which he poses this idea. Because his solution to the problem of big life and lives is something like a critique of life, and he ultimately draws on truth and time and so forth. Right? And so I'm curious because the way in which he poses the problem in afterlife is often is this idea that there is something like life itself, right? That we can actually never get at because we're always theorizing something else.
I think what he's saying is that that when we talk about life, we can never avoid that, even if we don't want it, even if we.
So I'm curious as to why. Why can't we think about life as instead of life itself? Why not think about it in terms of pragmatics, right?
Because I think pragmatically you run. I think he's right that pragmatically you run into all these, headache-inducing problems, basically.
But okay, so my thing, right? So
I'm trying to do an end run around it, I think.
Right. So panpsychism for you would offer. Panpsychism somehow is a pragmatics that allows you to do what exactly?
Again, it's a way of detranscendentalizing without becoming, totally reductionistic. In other words, it seems to me what Whitehead's doing. Whitehead, again, I've been doing a lot of reading and writing about all these current, mostly analytic philosophical discussions about consciousness and cognition and stuff like that. And there are several things which bother me in all this literature, which probably people here will be more inclined to agree with than any of the analytic philosophers will be. One is that they assume the priority of cognition. And that seems to me to be doing what it says, taking a specialized higher function and making it everything. So I really do think in feeling, using the word as a mere technical term in what it sense, precedes and makes cognition possible, but it's not self-reducible to just cognition. But feeling is always still a kind of immediate transaction which prevents it from having a capital F in the same way capital life itself. And you can see both, and again, if I'm arguing for continuity between causality and sentience, if everything has antecedents and everything arises from modifying its antecedents in one way or another, responding to its antecedents, that is causal efficacy, but it means that's both what physicists talk about, but it's also more complicated processes that the physicists don't do a good job with, which involve, in other words, It comes from just trying to displace, we have to figure out how perception works before we can figure out what we're perceiving. If we have this chiasmus, which I see Whitehead doing with this notion of causal efficacy, then I think we get around that. Now, I'm not sure that answers the question about life, but that's what I get from thinking about sentience or pan-experientialism or panpsychism instead of thinking about inorganic vitalism.
Right? Like
So what?
It just becomes a question of consequences, right?
Yeah, I mean, I can't make an ultimate ontological argument. I can say I find this, I can find this like a more useful way to work through these problems, or at least I think have the hunch that it will be, though I can't say I've worked through these problems, obviously.
Other questions?
Yeah.
Sure.
I'm kind of interested in how the ideas about causal efficacy, presentational immediacy can be applied to the discussions that come out of some quarters of the sciences, of the biological sciences, that show things, for example, or that want to say there's no such thing as free will because, for example, in certain studies, certain types of research, we can show that there are reactions, say, in the body before there's a consciousness, conscious awareness of the decision. The body is already reacting.
Well,
to me, it seems like causal efficacy is a
well,
great...
but I mean, that's in the Lee Bay studies, which say that we have an action potential readiness to do something half a second before we actually consciously will to do it. I mean, I think that just translates the question to another level, because presumably non-conscious processes in our bodies are making this decision, but it's still making a decision, even if it's... So, and that seems to say, well, the decision isn't really occurring in the conscious mind. But I mean, one thing, it's really weird when you read all this stuff by analytic philosophers as well as by biologists about consciousness. None of them even, they say there's automatic processes run like computers in the brains which are non-conscious, and there's our conscious, and that's deterministic somehow, and then there's our consciousness. And there's actually more gray areas in between. I think that's one lesson that I get from Whitehead, is that there are these gray areas in between. And Whitehead is, again, one of the reasons I tend to use the word panpsychism partly, because it's more provocative, though that may be that's often a bad reason to do anything. David Ray Griffin's pan-experientialism is a kinder, way of doing it. But Whitehead, Whitehead is saying that this chair has something like experience. He's not saying the chair is conscious, obviously. And this comes at, when you go look at analytic laws, David Chalmers comes close to a kind of panpsychism, but he says, well, a lot of people say this, well, if consciousness has to do with processing information, which to me is an induction I don't accept, but that's what many people today like to say, then, well, maybe a thermostat is minimally conscious because it has to decide between two states. So it seems to me that Chalmers is both being not panpsychist enough because he's reducing to this problems of information processing, but also too consciousness-centered because he's assuming that experience. So I would agree with him that there's something experiential. The thermostat is a very low grade, what I would say, of experience. I don't think that necessarily is consciousness. Consciousness, Whitehead says, is a very rare thing which only happens even for us, in very extreme circumstances. There's a lot of other stuff about consciousness studies which I think can follow if you try to think through things in this way. And it's just, it astonishes me that so little of this Whiteheadian way of thinking about it registers at all in the analytic philosophical literature.
We have time for one more question, if there is. Beatrice?
I actually sort of, going back to Adam's question about Eugene's book and just about the problem of life in general.
Yeah.
I maybe just sort of take a slightly broader sort of perspective on, to what extent do you think that Eugene's interrogation of life as a kind of concept is something that might be related to sort of life as a symbolic problem? Is there a sense in which life itself or discussions about life, the concept of life is sort of kind of caught up in some of these sort of...
Mm-hmm. But you mean it's about the concept of life, or it's about actual life?
Right, to what extent is right, to what extent is might Eugene's sort of discussion about life and ontologies of life also be about life as a sort of symbolic function or a symbolic category?
I'm sure he would apply them in those ways. This is the other part of Eugene's recent writing is is this stuff about, nihilism, or, I mean, the stuff which got quoted in True Detective last year and things like that, So I don't know. I mean, again, one way to solve this is say what I was saying to Adam, that I find it, more tractable, or doesn't get you into trouble if you do it through panpsychism instead of through panvitalism. The other way is I want to say is, rather than saying that sentience is possible because things are alive, and if something's alive, there's a potentiality of sentience, I'd rather say life is possible because sentience exists, and it's sentience which provides a precondition of the possibility for life, rather than life providing the possibility of sentience. So I admit I'm not answering your question, but I'm trying to, I have this hunch. Again, it's not something which I could prove rigorously philosophically, or which I feel satisfied in working it out yet, but my hunch or my sense where I'm going is that this might be a both more tractable and useful, and maybe a more accurate way of trying to think things through, since there are things which aren't alive but which do arguably have some kind of proto-sentience. I mean, it's also, it's pretty apparent now that all living things are sentient, including bacteria and trees and my favorite organism, slime molds. I mean, they don't have brains, they don't have nerve cells, but their cellular processes already have a certain amount of sentience. So now that entwines sentience with life. So that doesn't answer the question which is the condition for which, but that's all I can say, basically.
All right, join me in
Thank you
thanking
very
our
much.
presenter, yeah.